Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Deutchman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. We are so pleased that you could join us for this vital and timely discussion. As people entered the room, I will make an announcement like one would make at any live event, which is sometimes we have last-minute programmatic changes. In this case, Cecilia Kang, the National Technology Correspondent for the New York Times, and our moderator is not able to join us since she is covering breaking news. So I will be stepping into her shoes, albeit very large ones, to moderate today's discussion. I want to remind you that you're welcome to enter questions into the Q&A, and I'll do my best to integrate as many of them as possible into today's discussion. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our two esteemed panelists. Rebecca MacKinnon is founding director of Ranking Digital Rights, a research program at New America that sets global standards for corporate respect for freedom of expression and privacy online. The RDR Corporate Accountability Index ranks the world's most powerful internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies on relevant commitments and policies based on international human rights standards. A 2019-20 UC Free Speech and Civic Engagement Fellow and author of Consent of the Networked, the worldwide struggle for internet freedom, MacKinnon is co-founder of the citizen media network Global Voices, serves on the board of directors of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and is a founding member of the Global Network Initiative. Previously, she was CNN's bureau chief and correspondent in China and Japan between 1998 and 2004. She has taught at the University of Hong Kong, the University of Pennsylvania, and had fellowships at Harvard, Princeton, and the Open Society Foundations. And that was her short bio. John Palfrey is president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, one of the nation's largest philanthropies with assets of approximately $7 billion and offices in Chicago, Mexico City, New Delhi, and Abuja, Nigeria. Palfrey is a well-respected educator, author, legal scholar, and innovator with expertise in how new media is changing learning, education, and other institutions. Throughout his career, he has demonstrated a commitment to rigorous thinking, disruption, and creative solutions often made possible by technology, accessibility of information, and diversity and inclusion. Palfrey has extensive experience in social change, spanning the education, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors. Prior to joining the foundation, Palfrey served as head of school at Phillips Academy, Andover, the only school of its kind to maintain need-blind admissions. So, welcome, Rebecca and John. We are tackling a substantial and weighty question today. How should the Biden administration protect free speech and democracy in our digital world? And I think in order to answer that question, I think we need to start by identifying the nature of the problem. So I'd love to start by asking each of you to share what you think are some of the key challenges facing the new administration regarding the digital landscape. And, John, I'm going to let you kick it off.
So thank you, and I'm really thrilled to be with you, thrilled to be here with Rebecca. I think that MacArthur Foundation may fund virtually everything Rebecca is touching, from ranking digital rights to Global Voices to GNI, et cetera. So we're really excited to be here and be able to have this conversation. I will admit that I'm excited also that there will be a new administration to tackle these issues, and eager to see how the Biden-Harris administration approaches it. I think it's a very important topic to consider, and not an easy one. As Rebecca has written and others have written, the issues are tied up in a culture war that I think is not actually all that helpful. Curiously, I think we've gotten to a place where in some ways the left is for things like diversity and inclusion and rights and so forth, human rights, and the right is standing in for free expression. I think that's a huge mistake, particularly for the left, to cede that territory. So I think finding a way in which the Biden-Harris administration can be standing up for free speech, tying it to human rights, making it a rights issue, as Rebecca argues, and many others argue, I think is essential. So I know we'll get into the specifics, but I think an affirmative strategy that does value free expression, that reclaims it out of this frame that I think is a mistake and puts it front and center on the agenda is very important.
That's great. Rebecca.
Thank you. I just want to say, before I actually answer the question, I want to thank you, Michelle, and the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, for not only for organizing this webinar, but for having supported work that I was able to do over the past year as a fellow, and also just to say how happy I am to be doing this event with John Palfrey, who I've known for a long time. We've known I first got to know John when he was running the Berkman Center for Internet Society, now the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. He was actually the person who invited me to be a fellow there at the time, and who supported Global Voices, the citizen media network that Ethan Zuckerman and I co-founded, and of course, tremendously grateful. MacArthur, before John came to MacArthur, MacArthur was the first funder of Ranking Digital Rights, which I now run. So tremendous gratitude to both of you in different ways, but also just really happy to be here as old friends as well. But to get into answering the question, as John says, the question of free speech and really what to do about the internet has been hijacked by culture wars that has been brought into even more stark relief by this pandemic. Up until this pandemic, we were already starting to feel the consequences of just ceding the way in which the internet developed to the free market. I think too much reliance on just hoping that the market would sort things out. All of a sudden, we have this pandemic. Everybody's trying to learn from home, and we see tremendous inequities just in terms of access and so on. But also the tremendous power that a small number of tech companies have over our digital lives, which during the pandemic are much of our lives. And much of our political life and our civic life is so dependent more than ever on a very few platforms, in addition to our education and our jobs and everything else. And so the sort of lack of strong policy to ensure that people's rights are protected and respected, and the full spectrum of rights, I think is really coming into stark relief, or just even the ability to participate in the conversation in an equitable way, and the need for policy to step in. But we're now facing this moment, as John says, at a moment at which we also have a culture war, in which even though you have Republicans and Democrats agreeing that the tech companies have too much power, what to do about it and to what end, there is no consensus. So we'll talk about Section 230 later, but you have a situation where on the right, you have the president and others wanting to hold tech companies accountable for censoring too much, in their opinion, and then a great deal of concern about disinformation and hate speech and so on, more on the left, which results in the right calling the left or painting the left as censors, and sort of debates that end up being about how do you configure technology so that your side can win, or so that your side can at least claim to have a fair shake, rather than how do we govern technology and design it in a way that strengthens democracy, regardless of what party you belong to, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, and that we can have technical infrastructure and digital spaces in which people from a range of beliefs and as well as political persuasions, backgrounds, et cetera, economic backgrounds as well, can all feel like they're able to exercise their rights and have them protected. And we're just very far from that right now, and in danger of going down a further black hole if we're not careful.
Okay, so we've highlighted a number of serious challenges. I mean, just in those two answers, right? Equity, access, expression, who has the platform, who has a larger platform, culture wars, right? So, and I think it's interesting, and maybe John, you can comment a little bit on this, is these are very similar to some of the tensions that we're seeing, unfortunately, in higher education, with this idea where the narrative goes that either you're for free speech or you're for diversity and inclusion. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about how what's happening in the digital world is impacting learning and campus life.
Absolutely, Michelle, and I really credit your work and the work of the National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement at University of California as being one of the leading institutions pressing on this topic. And I know many higher ed administrators are with us today on the webinar. This is something that makes it very hard to be an administrator right now in higher ed and at the high school level as well. And I think the tension that you describe is exactly right, which is, on the one hand, academic freedom is just as important as it's ever been, for sure. The requirement for institutions of higher education to be zones of free expression is just as important as it always was. And so, too, is our press for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those things all are, in fact, trickier in the context of the internet, because the amount of speech, the ability for that to have an impact across lots of boundaries. So all the work Rebecca did to make sure that anybody could speak from anywhere and to gin that up, it also means that there can be effects of speech that happen in one corner of the world on others. So it has made the equation much trickier. The thing that I would argue is that we need to figure out a way to vindicate these rights equally, and or at least close to equally, and that we can't allow it to be you're either a censor who favors diversity and wants to make sure that everybody has equal shot at the educational experience in one of our institutions, or you are a bigot who's in favor of free speech, right? That split doesn't work very well, or at least it leads to the kinds of divisions we have in our country, or pushes those divides more further apart. And one of the things I would argue is that in part, what we're trying to accomplish with these goals, which roughly equate to freedom and equality, from the founding of our republic, is sort of the same thing, right? Which is that you want for different ideas and different backgrounds to come and contribute to the educational experience of all kids. But I think we have to realize that it's not equal when you walk onto one of these campuses, depending on what you look like. We are here today acknowledging we're an all-white panel, not on purpose, but sort of how it worked out. These are universities and schools like Andover that I led. These are historically and predominantly white spaces. If you walk in and you have more forms of difference, you're not going to get the advantage of all of that free speech in the same way, and you're going to suffer some of the disadvantages. So that's why it's a different equation, and it's trickier, and it requires a different kind of thinking than we had a generation ago.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And I just want to give a shout out. John wrote an amazing book, Safe Spaces, Brave Spaces, Diversity in Education, and I've read a lot of the canon on speech on campus. It's really one of the great ones. And, so I will put that in our resource follow-up email. And Rebecca, in the work that you have done and did for the center, you also talked about these sort of intersecting worlds of sort of the campus speech challenges and what's happening on the internet. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, John's book, and in which he sort of ties the two spaces together, it kind of helped inspire my project in many ways. And one thing that's really interesting that I think tech companies have to learn from, at least the experiences of campuses, even if universities haven't totally figured everything out, is that there's sort of an assumption. You hear this a lot in the speeches by Mark Zuckerberg and other tech CEOs about, we're just a neutral technology, right? And it's, good people or bad people use it for good and bad things, but we're just neutral. And we're just this neutral arbiter. But as universities have known for a long time, if you're a neutral institution and you're completely colorblind and completely blind to the context and social power dynamics the socioeconomic power dynamics of the people in your institution. And if you're just kind of assuming they all have the same power, and the same, that there are no imbalances that they're bringing to the equation, you're actually going to exacerbate injustice, right? We know this from housing policy, from education policy, from any number of other types of policy where for a long time, policymakers have recognized that if you're actually going to not perpetuate injustice and discrimination, you can't be totally neutral. And tech platforms are only just beginning to learn this lesson very much the hard way. There was a civil rights audit of Facebook that was published over the summer, in which Laura Murphy, the author, pointed out, look, you're claiming to be neutral, but actually your design is such that you're favoring the powerful and those who can pay to have their speech amplified, and you're enforcing your rules differently for public figures versus normal users, and you actually have to be aware of the power dynamics that you are perpetuating in claiming to be neutral, and you need to account for them, or you are going to exacerbate the injustices of this society. And so that is one way, I think, in which the private sector in the technology space can actually learn from those who kind of had some long, hard experiences and learn from some mistakes in the analog space. That there is a lot to be learned there.
Yeah, thank you. I one of the things I really love about your work, Rebecca, is this kind of breaking down of silos, that we can't just be higher ed and tech and, other things, that we need to learn from each other. And so I think that intersection is fascinating. We already have our first question in the queue, and I'm going to turn to that. I think that it's relevant. In American campuses are no longer just American campuses. We live in an increasingly global world. And so this question has to do with the efforts by foreign governments to control speech of their students on U.S. campuses, affecting free speech, on issues regarding those countries and on students from those nations. And I don't know, maybe John, if you want to speak a little to that, or Rebecca. I think it's a hard one.
It's such a hard one. I really appreciate this question from Samuel in the chat. I think that, one thing we need to do if we are an institution chartered in the United States and on United States soil is we need to be true to our values. And I think that's important. And we also need to recognize that just as we are American institutions, we're also participating in a global environment. And I think that is one of the many forms of diversity we need to think about as students come to our campuses. So the campus that I led had, 10 to 20% of our kids were from outside the U.S. or had multiple passports. And I think you have to acknowledge when a young person is coming from China, for instance, a place that has a very different free speech regime, and Rebecca's taught in Hong Kong for a while, knows this very, very well. The kids are coming with a different set of expectations. I don't think there's a ton of effect of the Iranian regime or the Chinese regime or other places that are more repressive on speech in terms of affecting our speech policy on campuses. On the other hand, we do need to think about the kids, and our job when you're running one of these places or a teacher of these places is to educate students. You have to meet them where they are. You have to bring them along in a journey. And some of them are going to have a very hard time when they recognize, in fact, how open the regime is that we have, and structuring our policies that are supportive of all those kids, I think was really the watchword for me. But Rebecca may have a different view, which would be good.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I would just add a few things that I think are challenging, but also relate to the online and offline kind of interconnection. Is that I have a background on China issues, and I hear a lot from people in academia who work on China, and as well as students, and there's a oftentimes, both with students and with faculty or lecturers, people participating in campus discourse, people will get warned by another student that this is going to have implications for your family back home. Or academics will be warned that, if you want access to research if you want to go research your subject of expertise in China, you better watch what you say on Facebook in this campus issue related to, I don't know, Tibetan students or something, because it's going to affect your access. And so there are a lot of these cross-border issues that also go across online and offline. There was a student, I think from Minnesota, who tweeted something while on a campus in the United States, and then went back home and faced retribution for that after going back home. And so, what to do about this? I think part of it relates to something that some of the other fellows and I talked a lot about is, to what extent can you solve a problem with rules, and to what extent do you solve the problem by kind of consulting with all affected people and designing spaces that address the threats they face or the inequities they feel and enable people to feel safe, right? So, this is where a professor might need to think about, okay, how do I have a conversation for academic purposes that also enables my students to feel safe, while also respecting and protecting people's right to free speech from different perspectives, right? Or the threats they face may be different depending on who they are, but how do you design these spaces in ways that you really have buy-in from the people who are affected, and the need to, I think, really listen and have awareness about the types of conversations you're having, in what context, but also really standing up for people when they do feel threatened. And there are issues also in relation to online spaces. How do we design them in a way that people can have the kind of civic conversations they need and feel safe in exercising their rights? And do you want that space to be just designed and imposed on you, or do you want to be able to co-create it as well? And is there enough opportunity to do that?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is sort of remedying potentially some of these design flaws and using different paradigms. And I think change is hard. And so it can be difficult to reframe things. Before we get to one of the next questions in the queue from Julie, I think we've gotten almost too far into our discussion without talking about misinformation and disinformation, because I think that's such a huge issue and is something that has really proliferated, especially in the last 4 years. And, certainly one concerning piece is that there seems to not be general agreement about how to define these terms. And I think that has serious implications for learning. And so one of the things I want to ask both of you, and we can start with John, is, if you're talking to the educators on today's webinar, whether those people are faculty or staff or administrators, what are your thoughts on how they help teach students how to recognize falsehoods and misinformation? Because I think that's such a key piece to critical thinking, but wasn't part of certainly the issue when I went to school. I wasn't being bombarded with information 24 hours a day.
I'm happy to, as long as Rebecca gets to go first on the next one, because I think I've gotten to go first all of them.
Fair enough.
As an educator, I think it's exactly the right question to frame this debate and to pull it from the internet and the sort of public sphere into the education environment. It's a wonderful kind of hard problem all wrapped together. I'm a big fan of librarians. I think that there are teachers in our environments that do exactly this by design in their profession. So I think one of the answers is to to wrap the library world into the learning that happens in the other kinds of classrooms, because I think that's in large measure the discernment of what's true from what's not true. And by the way, there are truths in the world. Like I think we need to get past the fact that it's not that there are everything is relative. There actually are things that are facts. That will be one nice thing to get back to, I hope, in a new administration. And I think then to say, okay, how do you discern things that are true from not true? I think that it needs to be a part of curricula. I think that it can be discrete, as in we're going to learn these particular skills, or it needs to be worked across the board into curricula. Having looked at this some, I think a very good place to start with many curricular interventions is middle school, it turns out. It's nothing perfect, but I think that is a good one for introducing some of these topics. I think you can do it quite deeply as kids get through into high school, and then certainly need to do in higher ed. But I guess my key point would be think about all of the people who are great teachers in our environments, and bring them into the mix, and don't overlook the world of librarians who I think are particularly good at it.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, back before all conversations about online media and credibility was about Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, we used to argue about Wikipedia and can you use can you trust what's on Wikipedia, or can you trust what's on blogs versus what's on professional journalism or your professional encyclopedia. And one great teaching tool is actually to have students edit a Wikipedia article and then have the editors challenge you for your sources, right? And just I guess the point being a key lesson about disinformation or what to trust online is to learn to see where it came from. And a great way to become more thoughtful about information online is to also be a creator of information, not just a kind of chatter on social media, but really kind of create a Wikipedia article or edit a Wikipedia article and see what happens, and just see how hard it is to agree on what the facts are in many cases. Once you get beyond a certain set of things. Chinese history entries on Wikipedia are really something in terms of the wars that happen around them. But that's a great way for I think students to really be thinking about just every time you see a piece of information, where did it come from? What were the sources? Who wrote it? What's their background? What perspective are they coming from? What was their motive? Perhaps all of these things that you need to think about.
I love that. I mean, in some ways it's very simple, but not obvious. It makes me think like, you know what, this seems like a great dinner table exercise, because I think that you're both right in the sense that if we wait to start this learning and critical thinking at college, it's too late. Right? I mean, it's never too late, but we want to be starting it earlier. So I think that's great. So Rebecca, you'll be first on this question, and then we're going to turn to a question about headlines. I wanted to go back to Julie's question to talk about the new administration. And what she asked is, do you think the new administration will be able to roll back the erosion of basically that's happened to the U.S. contribution to safeguard a free and open internet? And if so, how? So Rebecca, I'll let you take that away.
Right. So I think she's talking about sort of the U.S. Kind of foreign policy in supporting a free and open internet around the world. And I think we are going to need to sort of reboot that in a way. I don't think we're going to be able to just go back to where the Obama administration left off. And as I wrote in both the paper I did for the center and have written in some other things, one big challenge I think that we had to begin with, the U.S. was promoting a free and open internet as a key part of human rights, right? If you don't have a free flow of information, people cannot exercise their right to freedom of expression online or off. But the problem was that in the United States, in terms of our own domestic policy, we haven't really had consensus about how do you govern and promote free expression and freedom online, while also safeguarding other rights and ensuring that democracy can actually survive. That we don't have consensus about that, but also that the U.S. has promoted a free and open internet while also having sort of a few internet companies that very much benefited from that free and open internet in terms of gaining market share and economic power around the world. And so I think people in a lot of democracies, let's put aside kind of authoritarian countries for a moment, people in a lot of democracies have felt that the free and open internet was a way of promoting U.S. economic power. And so I think a really key issue is addressing the excessive power of this small number of companies, which hasn't been good for American democracy either, or arguably, various aspects of our economy, and that we need to ensure that there's competition. There's this antitrust suit that's just about to happen. We also need to ensure that there's privacy regulation so that these companies cannot abuse users' rights while taking advantage of the free and open internet, right? So there is an accountability and responsibility piece that the United States did not sufficiently emphasize, that it's going to need to emphasize I think going forward in order to have credibility in advocating for a free and open internet, because otherwise you'll just have countries just saying, okay, well, we're just going to put barriers up at our borders and have our own national internets, and that's fine. And that won't serve human rights and democracy much for anybody either, in most cases. So it's a challenging time in that sense.
Thank you. John, do you want to add to that, or should we go to the next question?
Just ditto. I think Rebecca framed it really well and super complicated.
This is all really complicated. So Rebecca made note about a kind of up news. Now we know what Cecilia was up to instead of being able to moderate this, which is that the New York Times just announced a significant basically lawsuits filed by 48 states and federal regulators against Facebook for illegally crushing competition. And so Joe has he's so up to the minute, he's asked our panelists, to what extent is it possible to really regulate these platforms within a First Amendment regime? And I think that probably we're going to get into, we might even have to touch on Section 230. So I'll let Rebecca go first again. I'm trying to be very equitable, and then John can follow up.
Yeah, well, it's hard, right? But certainly enabling competition and enabling a more diverse online ecosystem where people have more choice of what platforms they use, and who's controlling the speech on those platforms, I think can only be a good thing. So this is a good start. I mean, we'll see where the antitrust regulation goes, and what else it accompanies it. We do need privacy law, absolutely, to protect users of technology against abusive collection and sharing of their data that's exploitative, that's opaque. People don't understand how they're being targeted and tracked and profiled online, and how that's being sold and shared for all kinds of purposes that arguably is infringing people's rights. And so there definitely does need to be regulation. And we do need to hold the platforms accountable. And the question is how. And right now, as you mentioned, Section 230 is a legal provision that basically limits the liability of platforms for what their users say and do on the platforms, to make a complicated matter simple, and whether either that provision should be rescinded or trimmed back greatly. And then the question is, how do you do that? And is there consensus in what way you do it when, Trump has said he wants to rescind it so that he can hold platforms accountable for censoring him at all. Whereas others would like to trim it down so that companies have greater responsibility for a range of different types of speech, and that there will be more responsibility for them to police, let's say, hate speech, let's say revenge porn, and potentially disinformation, although again, how you define disinformation is a really tricky one. But in any case, to hold companies more accountable, or do you do it in some other way? And in the article I wrote, I talk about how you can actually use international human rights standards as a mechanism for accountability that might enable us to address accountability without getting into what I fear is a bit of a black hole of Section 230, because I'm concerned that politically there's not going to be consensus about in what direction you change it. But nonetheless, because with international human rights standards, actually there's a definition of free expression that actually applies to companies, whereas the First Amendment doesn't apply to companies. But also a definition of free expression that includes the right to information, the right to form of opinion without interference, which speaks to disinformation, and also an expectation that companies will mitigate the harm that they're causing to the rights of affected people who are affected by their business, and that they have an obligation to do so, and that might be an approach that would also hold companies accountable beyond U.S. borders. But in any case, I'll stop there. Other than to say that John has done a lot of work that maybe he can speak to about if one were to reform or reinterpret or reform Section 230 in a thoughtful way, and it didn't get over politicized in too many different directions, how might one go about it? But I think some of his thoughts there are worth hearing more detail on.
Great. Well, that's a perfect segue. And of course, we will share in our follow-up email the link to Rebecca's terrific Slate piece. And John, I'll let you take it from there, and then we'll go back to the queue.
Thanks, Michelle, and Rebecca, with her capacious mind, has covered a lot of ground. So let me just hit two particular things that relate to the original question and Rebecca's response. The first is, of course, it's extremely interesting to see what the FTC has put in its complaint, along with the attorneys general. I have not read it, nor have I. I'll start with Cecilia Kang's piece, and then I'll go and read the actual complaint and take it from there. So I obviously can't talk about the specifics of it. I will note it's unlikely that it's actually much about free expression in the strict sense. It's, I imagine, more about consumer protection and the fact that Facebook has gobbled up, Instagram and WhatsApp and so forth, and so many other potential competitors. So I guess I would see it as unlikely to be a watershed in a free speech sense. But I do think it's a very important step, of course, relative to constraints on the big platforms. I imagine it's it'll be another chapter, as the Microsoft case was to the 1990s for this generation of large tech companies, and hugely important from that perspective. So we'll see how it plays out. Relative to Section 230, I was glad that we might have potential disagreement, and Rebecca softened our disagreement at the end there. In her wonderful Slate piece, she calls going into Section 230 reform a black hole, political black hole, which I think is probably good advice for the Biden-Harris administration. But I will speak as somebody who's in Chicago, not in D.C. as she is, and somebody who's speaking more as a former law professor, and say, I have for a long time, certainly since the mid-2000s, argued that Section 230 needed some reform and needed to be cabined in some ways. I got focused on this in the sort of 2005-ish zone around child protection as the topic, which is to say that some tech companies at that time were hiding behind 230 protections to say, if there was, the solicitation of children on the internet, that the tech companies wouldn't participate in any way in protecting child safety because of Section 230. It was bizarre. Like, it was otherworldly that some tech company could say, we're not going to participate in any way with law enforcement to protect, a child who's being sought to be, solicited for sex and then sold into sex trafficking. Really? Like, that was the intent of this law? Go back and read the legislative history from the 1990s around Section 230, and it starts with, in some measure, being good Samaritans. And all of a sudden, 10 years later, these tech companies are saying, no, we're not even going to participate with law enforcement. Like, that can't be. It just was crazy. And then I think many scholars, Danielle Citron, 2019 MacArthur Fellow, many others have made, very important updates, I think, to the argument in lots of ways, extending ways in which it might be kept. So I believe deeply that there are ways to adjust 230 that have many of the important protections for speech and for publishers. But I think we have to relook at this question of, do we treat internet platforms differently than we treat other kinds of publishers? And it's still the case that you would treat the New York Times in their print edition differently than you treat Facebook or Twitter or others. Yes, they're different, but it is interesting, I think, that we have created, or kept a bifurcated world in these ways. I don't think it's been helpful in lots of ways. Now, Rebecca MacKinnon is much wiser than I am on matters of politics, and it may be right that taking that on right now is a political black hole or a disaster for the Biden-Harris administration. 230 reform has been hijacked by the soon-to-be former president in ways that I think are not helpful, and so maybe it's right that you don't do that, and maybe you look to other standards. And I think that's where her recent piece in Slate is worth thinking through. Is are there other approaches that would achieve the same end with fewer deleterious effects? I'm open to that argument, although I hadn't thought of it before I read the Slate piece by Rebecca.
Well, you want to go ahead, Rebecca?
Yeah, I guess it's less that we should never ever touch 230 under any circumstances, for all the excellent reasons you point out. But there are many other places that we can start that do not involve Section 230 reform, that might enable us to get much further and achieve greater consensus, and perhaps establish, I think, more common ground than we currently have in this country around the importance of free speech and around its positive relationship to civil rights, and that if we can establish greater consensus around measures and principles that can help us move forward and get away from the polarization, we might have a better chance of then revisiting Section 230 in a manner that might actually lead to some thoughtful legislation, as opposed to legislation on which people hang all of their favorite political obsessions.
That's a really interesting intervention. I hadn't thought about it, and it's compelling.
Yeah, I think this is going to be something everyone is closely watching. I think there's a lot of reading the tea leaves now. There has been something to be made of the fact that who the president-elect has appointed, Bruce Reed, to be his tech policy advisor, has made some pretty specific comments about 230 and sort of condemning it. And so I think there's a lot of people trying to figure out what's going to happen. And what we may have to do is do this webinar again in 6 months and see where we are. In the meantime, I do want to turn back to the queue because there's some interesting questions. One of them has to do with the idea of anonymity on the internet. And Stephen's sort of talking about one of the things that makes people feel safe when they vote is this idea of a secret ballot. And he's positing that anonymity in technology can be used to protect individual citizens and other ways of civic engagement. And he's asking the panelists for their thoughts.
Well, I'll jump in on that. Since I do have some thoughts, I do believe that, while a given platform has the right to require that people use their real names, I think that on the internet in general, the right to anonymity is actually quite important, or at least the right to pseudonymity, and which also relates to the right to encrypt your communications and make them secure. It's not the exact same thing, but they're interrelated in a number of ways. But that there are a lot of people who want to engage in civic activism, who, if they use their real name, are not safe. And obviously, in a place like Egypt or a place like Iran, or China, it's very obvious the type of retribution you might face if you're a member of a particular religious group that the state is opposed to, or if you're calling for if you're calling for multi-party democracy in China. Obviously, there are repercussions and reason why you need anonymity in order to exercise your rights. But even in the United States, in some communities, if you are very active advocating for LGBTQ rights, and your employer finds out about it, or even some just kind of nasty people in your neighborhood, you are not safe. Or people who are victims of domestic abuse, who are trying to advocate for their rights within a community without being subject to violent retribution. So there are any number of reasons why many Americans need anonymity in order to engage in civic activism and civic life and to exercise their rights. And so it is very important that spaces where people can do that can exist, and that people should be able to exercise their right to communicate securely, so that their identity is not exposed to people who will then violate their rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anonymous speech has a long and important role that it has played throughout history, and certainly more so in authoritarian regimes, as Rebecca has noted, but also true in the United States in important ways. I think that it is crucial to have mechanisms for people to be accountable for their speech as well. And I think a lot of it comes down to very important and complex questions of power and who has power, and also when and how those rights are being abused. I mean, and having a mechanism for law enforcement where it's legitimate to be able to do its job is also important. And that is something that every administration in every White House has to battle out. Right, there is always the law enforcement people are coming and talking about some aspect of things, and the free expression and the civil rights side are have to argue that out. And it's extremely important to have, I think, people who are grounded in values like the ones that Rebecca has argued for in her piece. And if you haven't read the Reclaiming Digital Rights piece that Rebecca published with the National Center, I think it goes into both in the executive summary and more broadly into what those values need to be. And so coming back to the Biden-Harris administration, I think it's an excellent guide for that.
Great. Just looking again at the queue, please, we're kind of coming up on our last 10 minutes, so I'm going to encourage people to add them in. I mean, we have micro and macro questions, and Joshua has asked, I think, an important question that fuses not just, free speech, but also freedom of the press, into this discussion, which is just talking about the recent attempt to censor the Voice of America, the White House correspondent, the continuous labeling of journalists as enemy of the people, and sort of, it harkens back to an earlier question about the erosion of things over the last 4 years, and what are the long-term, repercussions, and are we hopeful that we'll be able to reassert, our role as a sort of quote beacon of free speech, unquote.
Well, I'll jump in there again, as I'm on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I have to say the fact that this administration and president in particular has attacked journalists and sought to discredit them, and just there's a number of organizations just tracking and counting the incidents of violence against journalists in this country, and they're tracking them the way that these things have been tracked around the world. But it's just in the past couple of years that free press organizations have had to start tracking incidents of attacks on journalists in this country in the same way. And this has absolutely got to be reversed. It's absolutely essential that our political leaders, protect the right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. But it is hard because it does mean you do have to protect the right of a news organization that is criticizing you, as well as a news organization that is not. Even in the Obama administration, there were complaints. CPJ put out a report criticizing the Obama administration for going after whistleblowers and for not being so good about Freedom of Information Act requests by the press, and so we weren't perfect before Trump came in, but absolutely, I think we have a lot of work to do, sort of figuring out how we make sure that we really do lead by example. And really doing the work, I think, domestically in terms of restoring consensus about what it actually means to have a free press for all press, not just the press you like, and the press that kind of helps you make your case. What that actually means and why it's important and why we have to defend it. And we've just, the consensus around that has broken down in just incredibly dangerous ways.
Do you want to add anything, John, before we go to the next question?
No, and Rebecca's such a, so knowledgeable on this topic. It's totally right. I would only say, sort of in an editorial fashion, I sure hope we're able to restore that place in the world. It is one of the many embarrassments of the last 4 years that is going to be hard to overcome. But I actually, I believe it's pretty deep in our DNA, despite a blip of several years. And as Rebecca said, we weren't perfect before that, and so I think it's a work in progress. But I do think it is one of the things that makes the United States in this historical era stand out and to be a beacon in a positive way, which I think does stand for a particular kind of democracy. So I think we need to aspire to it.
I would agree, and I think that is a note of optimism and an important reminder that we weren't perfect before, and that we can certainly get there again, especially if we can build consensus. I want to turn back to another question in the queue that goes back to the kind of the classroom. One attendee asked, so they had a assignment that asked students to complete a set of questions for each online source they used, and the students interpreted that policy as don't use online sources, which is not at all what the faculty member intended. And so what this person is asking is, how do we encourage reflection on source credibility and incorporate it into student assessment? And John, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I mean, as most recently a high school teacher where I taught U.S. history, this is a very central kind of topic. And I go back to my point about librarians, where, inviting library staff into the classroom to be, many schools do have library staff to talk this through. I did that every term with our students to talk about source credibility, how you evaluate different sources. And of course, it goes to primary and secondary and tertiary, all that sort of basic stuff. But I do think that there are interesting questions about the validity of sources we find online that are essential. And you can imagine in this COVID era where students don't have the physical library to go to, it's everything right on a research project. So basically everything is, whether it's coming from a database or it's coming from an online site, you've got to be able to do this work. And it's certainly not about criticizing online versus offline, because it could be the same book that's just, on a Kindle or whatever PDF. So it's an essential skill for students right now. They can't get through school without it. I would note that there are a number of really cool things online that are highly credible and have been curated. So I've been working with a number of colleagues over about a decade on something called the Digital Public Library of America. I hadn't expected to talk about it today, but it's at dp.la. You can go online. It's got, I think it's 40 million plus sources. All of them have been vetted by librarians and archivists and people who are information professionals, around the country. and it rolls all that stuff up, and it has these really cool kind of teaching sets that teachers can use, but also students can go on to research and curate. And you can do a big Google type search, but you can also look at these sets. Most recent important thing that they put up was an exhibition on the role of Black women suffragettes, as an example, and how they led to the vote. And there's really cool, highly curated, very reliable sources in there that students can use. So introducing, I think, students to these high quality, very carefully done things is a way to teach that skill.
That is terrific. And we're going to put that in our list of resources. As someone who's a huge fan of reading in libraries, I love all of these shout outs to libraries today. It's hard to believe that we're like really coming up on our last 5 minutes. And so what I'd love to do is give each of our expert panelists just like a minute to sort of wrap up on either the kind of mega question of what should the new administration do, or really any other thoughts that they want to leave, our audience with as we move forward into this new administration and this, new year and hopefully some new developments in this area. Rebecca?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing I sometimes tell government people who I end up talking to occasionally, who invite me in to give talks about what should we do to fix X problem, and I think when it comes to policy that relates to the internet, we have to recognize you don't just kind of fix the problem like you fix a TV, right? So if we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we deal with crime and also have, respect civil rights in Washington, D.C., we're not going to just fix the problem, right? Or how do we ensure that our campus environment is safe and also, people can exercise their freedoms, right? You're not going to just fix the problem, right? It's an ongoing thing. No particular set of rules is going to leave you in a state where you no longer have the problem and everybody agrees. It's continuous negotiation and conversation that we need to have. And we need to recognize this, and also that everyone has a responsibility for ensuring that the right to free speech, our rights and everyone else's rights of free speech are protected and respected, while civil rights are also upheld. It's not just something you wait for the government to figure out, or you wait for your administrators to figure out, and then it's going to be solved. It's a common project we all have to work on, and that has to be worked on globally, given that it's all globally interconnected. And I think we need to proceed on that basis rather than assuming that you're just going to have a solution and everything's going to be fixed and done with.
Michelle, as you are independently a scholar of this space, I'll do 1 minute, but hope to hear your answer to that question too, because it'd be fun to hear your reflection. I'd say that the emphasis that we have had today on both having freedom and equality is essential, and having those things upheld in thoughtful ways is crucial. I think Rebecca's emphasis as a journalist in a field that's often among law professors, I think that's extremely important. I think that this administration should bring in artists and other people. I mentioned librarians, people who have different views on this, to be part of what I think is something essential to all of us as Americans and as citizens of the world, in what I hope is an increasingly interconnected global society, despite trends to the contrary recently. But Michelle, back to you.
Well, I want to just first of all thank both of you so much. We could go on for many more hours. I think I would just add that I'm glad that we're ending on this note of sort of optimism. I think 2020 has been a very challenging year for any number of reasons, but I also think there's an opportunity for innovation and creativity, and that with the right kind of listening and facilitating, like both of you have talked about, that there is the opportunity to create consensus and build new paradigms in certain cases, and then also rebuild ones that may have eroded. And I will just say that I'm glad that everybody on this call is going to be part of that, whether you're in higher education or in tech or somewhere else. I like what I just want to echo what Rebecca had to say, that we all have a role to play. And with that, I think I'll just, want to let people know we will follow up to share the resources and share the video. In January, the center is going to launch a new monthly virtual webinar series, which is going to be Speech Spotlight Live. Our first one is going to talk with the new president of the UC system, Michael Drake. But really, most importantly, I want to wish everyone, a healthy end of the year, a healthy beginning of the year, of the new year, and, wishes for like a happy and safe holiday season. And with that, we'll sign off, and I'll thank Rebecca and John again. Thank you.
Thank you